When it comes to video games, Sega has my heart. I grew up with Sega, and even though it wasn't our first system that we had, as that would have been for the Magnavox Odyssey 2, but it's not like Magnavox continued making game consoles afterwards. After that, it was the Sega Master System. And what I recall from back then is that it was my older brother and my dad. They were the ones that made the decision to get the Sega Master System, and I think that was a combination of my brother probably convincing my dad to do so because he was starting to become a fan of some of the arcade games, which is like stuff like Outrun and Afterburner. So he was wanting to get a system that could play those games at home. And then when we did get the Sega Master System, my dad actually ended up really liking Outrun. And so hence we became a Sega household. And I recall that we originally got the Sega, what was it? It was like the main one that has all the, because we got it all. It was the two controllers, the light gun, the 3D glasses, which those I believe you buy separately. Yeah, yes, that was separately because I do recall the box still for that, and eventually we even got a control stick. So we kind of went all out, right, in getting everything all at once, and so that was our first system in our house. But again, our love for Sega started before that, right? With a lot of the great stuff that the arcade was doing. Now, at this time, I would have been pretty young. Let's see, the Sega Master System came out in 1986, and then some of the arcade games, like Hang On and Outrun and all started coming out around 1985, 1986 was in that stretch right there. But I was too young to play those games in the arcade. I remember I was a bit intimidated. But I do recall seeing those games in the arcade for the first time, and it was truly mesmerizing and outstanding how incredible these games looked in the arcades. Because, see, back then, some of the more impressive arcade games at the time were still kind of experimenting with like the 3D effects were well, impressive for the time. They were still, look a bit archaic, right? And all. I mean, there was things like Pole Position, which was looking pretty good. And then there was some other games that had like 3D effects like Tempest or the Star Wars arcade game. I believe it was called like the Vectrex graphics or something like that, that could try to mimic like 3D. And it was pretty impressive at the time. But when you look at a superscalar arcade game from Sega, so for example, I think it started off with Hang On and then eventually Space Harrier, and then Outrun, and then several others, right? They continued afterwards, like Afterburner and such. It really was really cool, right? I mean, it was still sprites that were scaling, but they were moving at a very fast frame rate for the time, and it made for a really impressive 3D effect. And so you were truly looking at, like, it really started cementing which went on for a stretch there where if you wanted to see the best graphics of what video games could do, you had to go to the arcades. And while there was a lot of home ports, right, that were, they were done pretty well, but it was still, the arcade was a place to be. And again, Sega was a big part of that there. But like I said, right, we ultimately still went with the Sega Master System because even though the home ports of those arcade games weren't quite as good, there was still a lot of fun to play. Like I remember putting a lot of hours into the Sega Master System Outrun version, and then also Afterburner and Hang On. I never did get Space Harrier. That was one game as a kid that I always wanted and just never actually got to experience it. I remember there was one stretch there where we would get a game fairly often. For the time, I think like, if I recall right, I think my dad was buying us like almost like a game every other month or so, So, it was, fairly generous of him to do that back for us back in the day. And then also we had some cousins of ours that they lived fairly close to us. And so they also had the Sega Master system, which was interesting because, again, most kids grew up with, you either had the Nintendo or you had a bunch of friends that had the Nintendo also. But we had the Sega Master System, right? And we had friends also that had the Nintendo Entertainment System. But Sega was our system, though, and also my cousin. So we switched games back and forth, right, between us. And so we got to experience quite the library of games that way. And the games that we ended up getting, see if I remember these off the top of my head, but it was Hang On and Safari Hunt. And then also after that, let's see, we got Outrun, Afterburner, Aztec Adventure, Rambo First Blood Part 2, um, Vigilante, Zags on 3D, Ghostbusters. God, those are some of those are like the games that I can think of off the top of my head, right? That we actually own. But then, like my cousins, they had games like Rocky, Thunderblade. Um, what else did they have? Rocky, Thunderblade. Oh, and then eventually, because I would borrow these games quite a bit from them, was Golvelius and Fantasy Star. And those two games really changed things up for me, right? As far as my appreciation for just what kind of video games I would start liking, in the years that followed. But yeah, so it was the Sega Master System was definitely a cool little system, and I always thought that the 3D glasses on it were pretty cool, and just all the accessories and everything that I had, it just they just look cooler to me than what Nintendo was doing. And even though, I mean, back then, I was a kid, so I didn't really quite know. I mean, I knew Nintendo was popular, and I think I knew that it was more popular than the Master System back then. I just didn't know by how much, right? Because Nintendo was just dominating back then. But, the Sega Master System, though, it had also a lot of success in Brazil and also in Europe, too. Now, I believe a part of that was because Nintendo didn't actually have a system, the Nintendo Entertainment System didn't come out in those regions until much later. And so I think that pretty much explains why the Master System was more popular, was because, again, had Nintendo come out at the same time, I'm pretty sure that they would have dominated there too. At least that's my assumption. But because they didn't, though, right? There's a lot of kids in those regions there that was their nostalgia, that was their system. And so I think that's kind of cool, right? That at least in certain parts of the world, Sega Master System was getting a lot of love because it's a cool system. It has a lot of great games on there that I feel sometimes get a bit overlooked. But definitely a fun system, and just unfortunately got overshadowed by, Nintendo was just kind of a sort of a Nintendo was something else, right? And we'll talk more about Nintendo when I do its own video. But this Master System, though, was definitely a fun system, though. But then during the last stretch there where the Sega Master System was out, the arcade scene for Sega was still popping. And they started coming out with, I mean, they were still doing some 3D games, but they were also starting to come out with some pretty cool games that would become very synonymous with Sega. And again, all of this is before Sonic, right? Sonic doesn't come into the picture until later. I think that if you're maybe on the younger side and you're maybe wondering why some people have a lot of nostalgia for Sega, or that Sega started with Sonic, everything I've been talking about here so far, right, and even a little bit, and still a few years later too, is that this was all before Sonic the Hedgehog came out, because he didn't come out until 1991. But prior to that, though, we had we were getting some arcade games that were coming out. As I forgot the name of the arcade boards, but there was like the but basically Sega kept making some improvements on it, and so we started getting things like Altered Beast, Shinobi, Golden Axe. Those were some pretty popular games that started coming out in the late 1980s, and the graphics on them were pretty impressive. As again, they still had, I mean, they had a little bit of like scaling, right, and all, but otherwise they were like 2D action games of some sort. And so, like Altered Beast was yeah, this is I remember for some reason I always liked the concept of this game where you're this, a Greek warrior, and then you get these power balls that, like turn you into a big old Herculean looking dude, and then eventually you morph into an animal. I just thought the whole concept of that was cool. And then Shinobi was just some pretty fun ninja action. I mean, ninjas were always cool. And then just getting him to do the ninja magic, and he goes, Hoya! I just always thought that was pretty cool. And then Golden Axe is a game that I have a lot of fond memories of in the arcade, as we had a little mini mart near close to us, and they had they usually had like 2 arcade games there, and they would rotate them out every so often. And so at one point they had Golden Axe there, and I don't know what it was about this game that just lured me to it. Maybe because it was Sega and it was kind of like a barbarian kind of hack and slash game. And so by this time I was already comfortable enough to play arcade games, so I would start playing it, and I would get kind of far in it, because in reality Golden Axe in the arcade it's not a very long game. But but I remember I kept I would only have like maybe like a dollar's worth of quarters or so, right? That I could take over there at a time, and so but I started getting better and at the game and better, and so the owner of this mini mart lived right across the street, and so his son, who was a little bit younger than me, he would at one point he saw me play the game, and so it got to the point that he would wait outside, and because I guess he kind of started figuring out when I would go over there, and so once he saw that I was entering the store there, that he would come along and so he can watch me play it. And eventually, when I finally beat the game, it was the first arcade game I ever beat. I remember him cheering me on, and also I thought that was kind of cool back then. But yeah, I mean, these were really great games. And eventually, what was cool though is that the Sega Genesis was right around the corner, and it was helped out because we had some really excellent ports of these games here. I feel that's what got the Genesis popularity at first, was that it was getting closer to bringing that arcade experience at home. So again, so we got Alter Beast was the pack-in game for the Sega Genesis, and then Golden Axe would come a little bit later, and we didn't get Shinobi, the arcade one, but we got its sequel, Revenge of Shinobi, which is kind of sort of like an arcade style game as well too. And so the graphics, yeah, because there was this commercial, very popular commercial, Genesis does. You can't do this on Nintendo. Genesis does. And it was showing off the, some of the early games that came out on there. And then also there was another trailer too where they started showing off the comparison shots, right, between like some of the arcade games and then the home port. So Golden Axe, Super Hang On, and I think Altered Beast. And so again, it wasn't quite arcade perfect, but people were like, "Oh wow, look, this is actually getting pretty close to the arcade experience at home." And so, and I remember too, for me, the box of the Sega Genesis, the original launch model, was, I think, one of the coolest ever. It had, I just always loved the look of the Genesis, with a sleek black look. And then also they kind of switched it over from what the Sega Master System was doing with a white background with a black grid. Now it's a black background with a white grid. And then it had the picture of Alter Beast on there right after he's morphed into the werewolf. And it just looked really cool. And so that was always a standout. And I always have a memory of this here when we got the Sega Genesis, as we were really wanting it. So the Sega Genesis came out, I want to say roughly around the end of summer of 1989 or so, give or take. Now this is here in North America. And so we really wanted it. So we kept bugging my parents for it. And at one point, I think my dad was just kind of saying, like, I'm not going to get that for you guys. I think he was just trolling us. But it was sometime in December. So we went to a mall, and there was a KB toy store, I believe. And so my brother and I, so when we would go to the mall, usually there was right at the entrance that we would go into, there was a arcade right away from when we entered it. So usually my brother and I would go in there and play in the arcades while my parents went and did their shopping. And then after that, we just kind of walk around the mall. And then at some point we'd meet up somewhere. It was all before cell phones. It always trips me out, right? And all, where we were just, you just walk around the mall, right? And all, and then just try to find each other. But anyways, we were walking around, and then we were going to KB Toy Store. But then as we were approaching the store, we saw my dad walking out with a big bag, and we could tell through the bag, because it was see-through enough, that the Sega Genesis was in there. So from a distance, right, my brother and I were like, oh crap, wait, don't, it looks like he got us a Genesis, and trying to hide so that he wouldn't see us. And so we were all pretty excited. So we had a few weeks left until Christmas, and we were pretty much sure, like, okay, we got the Genesis. And so we got some presents at Christmas, and it was funny because we were, as we were opening up our presents, we're like, okay, cool, but where's the Genesis? Because I wasn't seeing a present that looked like it could be the Genesis. We still got some great gifts, and I give it up to my parents, right? They definitely tried to make our Christmases special. But I remember we got Altered Beast, but on the Sega Master System, which, if you know anything about that game, it's not exactly a great port of Altered Beast. Altered Beast gets a bit of a bad name nowadays, but I always liked the game. I thought it was always pretty cool. But yeah, the Sega Master System version, not a great version. And so I remember being a bit bummed after we went through our presents, because I was like, well, where's the Genesis at? Well, I think my dad knew that we had seen him, so he was trolling us for a bit. And so later on towards, because we would celebrate our Christmases on Christmas Eve, we would open up the presents like around, I don't know, 8 o'clock or so, because we would just bug my parents, right? And I think they just got fed up with it, like, fine, open up the presents then. And, but it was getting towards later on in the night. And so then at one point, my dad said something like, hey, can you go to your sister's room? I left a pack of batteries there. And I was like, okay. And so when I went over to her room, there on the bed was the Sega Genesis box right there, right? And so I remember yelling and screaming, like yelling to my brother, like, dude, we got the Sega Genesis. And so we plugged it in that night. And that was mind blowing though, because, it was, this is where I really started to appreciate like the jump in graphics and just overall experience, right, from going from one generation to the next. Because again, when we got Altered Beast, we were playing it there for a bit, right, until my dad told me to, told me to go check in the bed where I found the Sega Genesis. And so we'd been playing Altered Beast for a bit on the Sega Master System, which again was a bit choppy. It doesn't run very well. But then after we got the Sega Genesis, we plugged it in right away, and then we popped in Altered Beast, because again, that was a pack-in title. And just seeing that leap in graphics was amazing. I mean, it was so like mind-blowing, right? I was like, this is almost like the arcade. And while again, it doesn't quite look as good as the arcade, it does actually have one thing though that the arcade doesn't have, and that's parallax scrolling. And so it was amazing. It was truly something else, and definitely felt like what their slogan was, right? Welcome to the next level. And so it was a great time. I really felt that that's like one of the first times that I felt like that big jump in the generational leap right between consoles, and was really something special. And then eventually, like I said, right now when we got Golden Axe. That was another really good arcade port. Ghouls and Ghosts, that was another really good arcade port. And then Super Hang On, Outrun, there were pretty decent arcade ports as well too. Again, not quite arcade perfect, but still pretty good. And so initially the Sega Genesis had a pretty decent lineup at first. And the other thing too that really surprised me as well too is the sound as well too. Now, the Sega Genesis sometimes gets a bad rep for its sound chip. The thing was, though, that put in the right hands, the Sega Genesis could actually do some really good sound. Later on, there was some kind of like an audio program that many developers use, I think more specifically Western developers, that sort of gave it a generic kind of like, I don't know, a certain sound that sounded a bit grating. But early on, and then especially with a lot of Japanese developers, they just seem to be able to utilize the sound chip a bit more. And so a lot of the games that came out on the Sega Genesis, they sounded fine, right? But it wasn't until I remember when I first heard Yuzo Koshiro's soundtracks, specifically for the Revenge of Shinobi and Streets of Rage 1 and 2, that I was truly blown away. And I was like, what is this music, right? It was, it got to the point too that some of our non-gamer friends at the time, when they would listen to his music, they're like, hey, this is pretty poppin', right? Because at the time, techno was really big. And I remember we were getting into techno. And so when they would hear this music, they're like, that sounds pretty badass, actually. And so I'll play a little bit of their music, of some of his music here. Yeah, just some really cool stuff. And we had like a boom box there where you could put a tape in and then record sound. And so we used to put it right up to the TV that we had and turn it up really loud just to record the music from like Streets of Rage and The Revenge of Shinobi on a tape. And we used to listen to that driving around. Yeah, good times. But yeah, that was the other thing too. Like I said, the sound was just improving as well too. It was all just a really cool experience. And the other thing too, also that the Sega Genesis did really good pretty early on. So again, they didn't have a mascot. So my understanding, well, I mean, they had Alex Kidd, but Alex Kidd was, it wasn't quite as, um, he just wasn't that popular of a mascot. So what Sega did originally with the first CEO, I believe Michael Katz, is that they signed on a bunch of celebrities to endorse some of their games. So and specifically more with sports games. So they had Arnold Palmer's golf, Tommy Lasorda, who was a coach for the Dodgers at the time, Tommy Lasorda baseball, Pat Riley, the legendary coach for the Lakers there for a while, Pat Riley's basketball, and then eventually Joe Montana's football. So Sega themselves, right, had a pretty good celebrity endorsement on the games, and then eventually they got Michael Jackson too with his Moonwalker game. Now there was a Moonwalker game that had already come out on the arcades, which was sort of like a isometric view kind of action game, if I recall right. This is more of a side-scrolling game, and it's actually not that bad. It's the music is actually pretty cool in it. It had pretty good renditions of some of his more popular music, and it's an okay game, but yeah, so again, they were starting to get all these celebrities, but then eventually they got EA Games, or EA Electronic Arts, what they were known at the time, to start doing some games for them. My understanding of how that all went is that Electronic Arts actually sort of reverse engineered the Sega Genesis so they could start making games on there without their permission. But Sega kind of needed some more sports games on their system. So Tom Kalinske, who was the CEO of Sega now at this time, after he replaced Michael Katz, and some of his staff went over to them. They made a deal with Electronic Arts or so to start getting some of their games on there. And so some of the early games were like, for example, John Madden Football, and then some other early games, and then like Lakers versus Celtics. And John Madden Football, though, this was the start of a legendary franchise, right? For football. I mean, it's still ongoing to this day. It's pretty much what you think of video game football is John Madden Football. And it wasn't the very first John Madden game. They had already been doing stuff on the computers, but it was the first console one. And so, yeah, I mean, this game was, we had a hell of a time playing this game, or I should say a fun time playing it. And I remember we would, host like these little tournaments in our room, me, my brother, and some friends. And it got to the point where we would rotate the controller around, right, playing. And then one of us would like act like announcer to the game, and we would record ourselves, right, and all, just the audio basically. No, I think we even did video at one point. So we were trying to stream, I guess, quote unquote, back in the day, right, in our whatever tools we had at the time, right? I wish we still had some of those recordings, because God, I can imagine they'd be pretty cringe, but still, it would have been fun if we would have kept them. But yeah, John Madden Football, it entertained us for hours, and it was a blast to play. And even to this day, I think it's still, a pretty solid playing football game. I mean, sure, yeah, eventually, right, they got the NFL license, and so you had more options and all. But just the base gameplay, I felt was always pretty good, and even the scaling on it and all, I thought was pretty smooth for the time. So they hit it right with that first one, and it was a smart move for Sega to get Electronic Arts on board. Because Sega's own football game, Joe Montana Football, that game there, it kind of struggled a little bit at first, but eventually it kind of grew into its own thing too, with the sports talk that it had on there. And I'll see if I can give a little thing here on what that what that sounds like.
Ready to go. Detroit in the tight formation. Gets the block.
But yeah, it's and then eventually it kind of turned into, it kept improving on itself. So Joe Montana Football was a decent football game, right? So it was a good competitor to John Madden Football. And actually in some of the later versions of Joe Montana Football, at least at the time, I actually preferred it over the Madden games. But but then that was the thing, right? We just had a lot of choice, and the Sega system was just a powerhouse when it came to football games or sports games overall. And I mean, that was one of the things that really helped it compete against the Super Nintendo at the time. But all again, this was starting to happen right enough before Sonic, right? But then Sonic the Hedgehog did come into the picture here. And so With Sonic the Hedgehog, I remember at the time, I thought it was pretty cool that Sega finally had a mascot that people really seemed to care about. Because I mean, I was, like I said, everything I've talked about already, I was a big fan of Sega already. And so I just wanted it to get more recognition. And Sonic was it. So it came out in 1991, and basically they made Sonic to really try to compete against Mario, and he does have the appeal for that. And as a character, I do prefer Sonic over Mario. And his first game was pretty good overall. In retrospect, I don't think it's better than Super Mario World that it went up to compete against. But at the time, though, I remember I was like, this looks more colorful. This plays faster. This feels different. He feels, Sonic the Hedgehog is a much cooler character. It feels more, at the time, modern. And I just thought that I was like, Sonic is going to overtake Mario, right? I mean, there's no way people can still prefer Mario over this. And for a stretch there, it almost seemed to be the case. And like I said, right, and all, Super Mario World has aged better than the original Sonic the Hedgehog game. But at the time, it was pretty impressive. And even then, they were showing off some, they would do like interviews with some kids that were, playing Sonic the Hedgehog on these kiosks. And they would ask them, which character do you prefer more, Sonic or Mario? And a lot of kids were saying that they preferred Sonic. And so that was, it was interesting, right, as the things were sort of shifting. And so I got to play Sonic the Hedgehog as... I had a friend of mine. No, I'm sorry, a cousin of mine. He had a friend that he would get a lot of games, and so he would let us borrow his games as long as we went over to his house to get them. And he lived a little ways away from where I lived at, and so basically across town. And now I didn't live in the town that I grew up in was fairly small, but it was still a bit of a length, right, to go there, especially as a young, I was what, 9 years old or so. So I would get my bike and ride it all the way over to the other side of town to go get some games. And that's how I first played Phantasy Star 2 also, which Phantasy Star 2 was just something else. And, that game, I was already a big fan of the first one. And with Phantasy Star 2, it really just kept cementing more and more, right, my love for this hobby. And it was just, it's a very difficult game. And, it's still kind of an early RPG. So the plot development and the character development and all is still a little limited, but just the overall imagination of the game and everything, it was still pretty impressive. And I fell in love with Phantasy Star 2. But that's how I first played it, was through him. And then also he had Sonic the Hedgehog. And so he let me borrow it. And so that was my first experience with it. And I liked it at first, but as much as I can appreciate the character Sonic and all what he did for Sega and the video game industry and all, I'm like I said, I do like Sonic the Hedgehog. I think they're fun games, but I also gotta say I'm not like a huge fan of them, right? I mean, they're entertaining, they're fun, but they're never really amongst some of my more favorite games, though, except for Sonic CD, which that one I do really like. But other than that, though, I mean, I think they're fun, they're great, but I just never really held them to the high esteem as I would, like, say, for example, a Mario game on a Nintendo system. But again, right, I can understand he's really popular and can appreciate that, right, for what he did for Sega and the video game industry. But yeah, so that was that early stretch there, right? And, just there was a lot of great games on the Sega Genesis that, it'd be a lot to mention here. And I just, as the time started going on, we got into this magazine, Game Fan magazine, and they were a bit biased towards Sega, which for me, that really helped cement my love for this system, because most other publications out there were a little bit more biased towards Nintendo. And again, granted, Nintendo had the more popular games, the more popular name and all. And so, I mean, it made sense, but this Game Fan magazine, they were a bit biased towards Sega. And so we started reading their magazines. And so eventually because of them is why we ended up exploring the big library of the Sega Genesis games, as there was also a few video rental places in our areas that started renting games. And so my brother and I, it almost seemed like every week we were trying to rent at least one or two new games. And so we got to experience quite a bit of Sega Genesis games. And some of them were going off of the recommendations from this magazine. So from what was a stretch of like 1992 all the way up until the Sega Genesis was really market relevant, like 1995 and 96 or so, before we made the jump to the next system. I mean, we were playing so many games there. And I think that's why I have so much nostalgia for the Sega Genesis, was because not only was it a great system, but also because I got to play so many games on it. I mean, everything from like Green Dog to Gunstar Heroes to Lightning Force to Streets of Rage 2 to Castlevania Bloodlines to Contra Hardcore to Dynamite Heady, Earthworm Jim, Kid Chameleon, Landstalker, the Shining Force games, so many great Sega Genesis games, and and it was a lot of the sports games like Evander Holyfield as well too. Again, a lot of the Electronic Arts games, FIFA Soccer and all, and it was great. We had such a fun time renting games on there, and yeah, that was a fun stretch there, and yeah, and we beat several of them as well too. I remember that. So yeah, so many great memories of going to, what was the name of the store? It was called Video Directors. And I remember because they had the store at one location, which was fairly close by to where we lived at, but then eventually they moved it over to another location, which was a bit further away. But luckily, at around this time, my brother was already starting to drive, and so we would drive over there to this video game place, and just again, it was almost like a weekly habit, if I recall right. We were just running so many games, and and again, just reading this Game Fan magazine, and it was just it was a fun time. I mean, this is where I was like really hardcore into Sega, right? And it was a great time. Yeah. And then not only that, eventually we met these friends that it was also two brothers, and they were roughly about the same age as my brother and me. And they had not only the Sega Genesis, but also the Sega CD. And so as we got to talking to them, it was pretty cool, right? Because again, most of the kids in the like that we would talk to, like friends and all. Well, first off, as we started getting a little bit older, we had less and less friends that would play video games, let alone the Sega Genesis, let alone the Sega CD, right? Because again, the Sega CD was a bit more niche. But these two brothers, they had the Sega CD, and so we got to talking, and so they, so we went over to their house one time, and we got to check it out, and we thought it was like the coolest thing ever because they had a Sylpheed. And Sylpheed, I remember, was that was a game changer for me to be able to see this level of graphics at home. And I was just so blown away by it. And, because at the time, so this would have been in roughly around 1993. And so Star Fox had also just come out on the Super Nintendo. And that was pretty impressive, right? Star Fox was cool. But the Sylpheed, though, and granted, it's aided by the power of a CD console, but it was truly stunning, right? And I remember looking at it and thinking like, this is getting closer and closer to what we were seeing, in the arcades. Now, Sylpheed, as far as I know, I don't think it was based on an arcade game. It was its own original thing. So I didn't have like an arcade version, for example, to compare it to. But what I was seeing was just impressive, right? And, it was using like flat shaded polygons. And from my understanding too, I think that the backgrounds they did in I think it's like pre-rendered, I think. So it's not running the polygonal graphics in real time is kind of my understanding of it. But the effect is still pretty impressive. And I was just, it was amazing what I was seeing. And so the Sega CD gave us a glimpse of what the next generation would bring. And then also just hearing, music and CD quality, right, was pretty outstanding as well, too. And so immediately we ended up getting the Sega CD. By the time we got it, though, the second model was out. So that's the one that we had. So the one that has a pop-up lid. And I have this weird memory. First, it's kind of funny, but I have this memory of playing the Sega CD and whatever first games we got for it. But playing the Sega CD while also listening to Eazy-E's Real Motherfucking G's, because my brother had gotten that CD at the same time, and so we were listening to that. No, and actually there's a song that goes, Merry Motherfucking Christmas, and I have a fucked up new year. And we were playing that CD again, because it was around the Christmas time that he got it. So that would have been around the Christmas of 1993 or so. But anyway, just a core memory. But good times though. But Yeah, it's the Sega CD was something else. And so with these friends, we were borrowing games back and forth with. So we would get some games and then they would get certain games. And like we had, let's see, just kind of thinking about it real quick. We had let's see what game we got. Kind of drawing a bit of a blank. What did we have on the Sega CD? Because we got a decent amount of games. We had Lords of Thunder, Sonic CD. Um, what else did we get? Sewer Shark, but that was a game that came packed in with it. Snatcher, we eventually got Snatcher, and that was an experience right there. Snatcher was my first taste of like what a Hideo Kojima game is, and that game truly like started leaving a big impression on me as far as what video games could be, right? The storytelling behind it. Because I was starting to become a big fan of like the storytelling in video games. Because I was noticing that it's a bit more than just, there's just not just for playing, right? Like it can tell a good story. And, I was already a big fan of like movies and reading books and all. I just love like getting lost in worlds and all. And so that video games was kind of bringing the best of both worlds was where I really started liking this. I mean, there was other games that were doing that, for example, the Fantasy Star games, eventually like Final Fantasy games and all. But Snatcher was, with at the time it had decent voice acting and it was I mean, the story played out almost like a movie, right? And as far as like it's at the time anyways, right? Like its maturity and storytelling, the themes of it and all. And so, yeah, Snatcher was something else. That was quite the experience. But then also, what other game? We actually had a decent amount of Sega CD games. I'm just kind of drawing a blank on some of the ones there that we had. But our friends, though, so they had Sylphid. I remember borrowing that game from them quite a bit. And then also Lunar, the Silver Star story. And that was another game, too, also that I got absolutely immersed in. It's a really great RPG, and this Sega CD version, I think it's cool because it's the soundtrack to it is truly some of the best music you'll ever hear, and I was a huge fan of it. And while the remakes that they've done afterwards are really great, and the music is still really great in it too. I think it's still by the same composer, but something about this version though that just has a certain vibe about it that in some ways I prefer this Sega CD version over the remakes. Either way, Lunar, the Silver Star story, whichever version you choose to play, it's good. I would say, though, that if you start off with one of them, definitely give the other one a shot, too, also. Because I feel like it's more or less the same game, but just a different version of it, I guess. That's different enough, right, to warrant two playthroughs of each one, or, playthrough of each one. But yeah, Lunar was something special. And that game was, when I played that game, when my friend let me borrow it for the first time, so Lunar has like its love story to it, right? It's very cute. It's a really nice game. It's a very feel good game. And at the time when I started playing it, I was dating this girl. This would have been in ninth grade, and I remember. So I started playing the game, and then I was gonna meet up with her in a roller rink that's like right next door to where my parents live. It's literally like the third building next to us, and so. No, I forgot how this went down, but like she was gonna meet me there, but then she said no. But I had a suspicion of something, if I recall right. So I walked over there because again, it was literally just I could get there like in about a minute, and I remember peeking through the door because they had like a kind of like a window through the door, right, that you can see through, and she was there with someone else. So this was my first experience of what it felt like to be cheated on. And I was absolutely heartbroken, right? I was upset. I was heartbroken. I was just very, very frustrated and started getting a bit depressed. So I remember I went back home and just started playing Lunar again. And that game right there, because I beat it like within a day or two or so, right? I mean, it's for an RPG, it's not too terribly long, but it's still, a bit of a stretch, right, to play through in one sitting. So I beat it within like 2 days or so. And it really helped me get my mind off of things. And as upset as I was, right, with everything that went down, and because obviously we broke up afterwards, and as I was upset about it, I was a bit starting to get very cynical about like the thought of like even dating a woman and all. I was still young, right, but just right off the bat, I was already getting a very bad vibe about all that. The little love story between Alex and Luna sort of helped me, I guess you can say, kind of get through that rough patch there, as cheesy as it sounds. But I do thank that game a lot for that, as that helped me get through that stretch there. But the Sega CD though, I mean, it was the games that took advantage of the CD hardware were pretty impressive. Another game that we had that I remember playing quite a bit was Dracula on the Sega CD, and the game it's all right, but like the pre-rendered full motion video backdrops that it had was pretty impressive, and so I remember playing it a lot for just to see the effects on it, and I thought that was pretty cool. And but yeah, the Sega CD, that was it's one of the more underrated systems I feel out there, because even though it's an add-on to the Sega Genesis, it has a big enough library and original games on it that I feel like it's worth exploring the library of. The games can be kind of expensive, so just a heads up if you were to seek out those games. But it's overall though, it's pretty cool stuff though. But yeah, but a lot of great memories with that system there. And again, with the Sega Genesis there, it's truly some of my more funnest memories of just playing video games in general. It was, and also because of the age that I was, so again, from the Sega, when the Sega Genesis was relevant, I was about 9 to like 15 or 16 years old, right? So I was still fairly young, but old enough now to where I have, very vivid memories of it, and just a great time. It was truly magical. But then we started moving over to the next generation. And so, but before we got the next home game, what was coming out in the arcades. And so now Sega was messing around with their Model 1 hardware, which we were getting things like, still doing flat shaded polygons, but like Virtual Racer. And so that was a polygonal racing game where you're driving like these F1 racing cars. And there was actually a very, I'll say an ambitious Sega Genesis port, but Virtual Racing though in the arcades, while I didn't see it back then, just other than screenshots, it was pretty impressive looking. And, because again, one of the things that a lot of 3D games at home anyways were struggling with was their frame rates. As any game that would try to do 3D at this time, a lot of times it would be a bit choppy. I mean, Sophie was doing a pretty good job, and also Star Fox, for being on a cartridge, was pretty impressive too. But Virtual Racing was something else. And then we had Virtual Fighter, which that was also really impressive too. And again, I didn't see it in the arcades back then at that time, but I can imagine it would have been really cool to look at, because we're getting like really smooth frame rates, and even though it's flat shaded polygons, but just the movement of everything and all was, I think, what was impressing a lot of people. And not only that they could play good, right? Because now we're getting to the point where like we can manipulate these polygons to not only look good and run really smooth, but that the gameplay also is really polished as well too. And I think that's what made those games stand out a lot there. But then eventually Sega pretty quickly jumped over to the Model 2 arcade board, and now we were getting stuff like Daytona USA, and Daytona USA is insane. But we having looked at it back then, because this one I do recall seeing this, because they had like there was a version of it where it was like the 8 where it had like 8 arcade cabinets, but like where you sit down on it. And so you can all play like multiplayer, right? Because Daytona USA, I mean, it's like there's a lot of cars on the track, right? And so just, I never got to play it that way. I remember seeing it in an arcade. I forgot where exactly, but because it wouldn't have been where I lived. And I think we went to the city one time and I saw it. I have a memory of it, seeing it, and I just thought it was like the coolest thing ever, right? And then you're seeing texture map polygons running at 60 frames per second, right? With a lot of detail and all. It was like, it was truly mind blowing, right? Sega was still doing some awesome things in the arcade, and they were just evolving, right? From what we had already seen before. So that was nuts, right? And then of course the classic Daytona music, right? Never gets old. And then also they had Virtua Fighter 2. Now, that one I didn't get to see in the arcade at the time, but again, it was just groundbreaking, right, on what they were starting to do in the arcades, again, with texture map polygons now, not just flat shaded, and running at 60 frames per second. And again, the gameplay is getting even more refined. So it was truly giving us a vision of the future. But we were able to get a taste of that at home now with the Sega Saturn. And the Sega Saturn is another system like the Sega CD that I feel doesn't... Well, I should say that the Sega Saturn seems to have found an audience now, which is unfortunate, right? Many years afterwards, but The Sega Saturn, I feel it's also one of my more underrated systems out there. I feel as such a great system that, but the whole thing on how this led to the Saturn and all is interesting because this is where Sega started making a lot of mistakes, unfortunately. But prior to this, it's interesting because there's one of the biggest what if there's stories in video game history. It revolves around Sega, Nintendo, and Sony because that stretch right there, as we started entering into the fifth generation, things could have played out much differently than what we see now, right? PlayStation gets a lot of shit nowadays, and rightfully so. I'm doing this sort of like a memories of series where I'll be talking about Sega, which I'm doing now, Nintendo, and then eventually PlayStation and Xbox. We'll get to the whole PlayStation thing right now when I do a thing on that. But so they're getting a lot of hate for it now, right? But even though you can pretty much say though that PlayStation is sort of like the top dog when it comes to like the best console system out there that has like the latest and greatest, right? You can argue Nintendo as well too, obviously with the Switch and all, but but they don't always get like the latest and greatest games, which the Switch 2 is kind of changing that. But for the most part though, right, it's been Sony. Okay. And but back then though, things could have been changed though, because kind of long story short, what happened is that Sony was going to partner with Nintendo. They were going to make a PlayStation because it was going to be a CD add-on to the Super Nintendo where the Super Nintendo could play CD-based games. Last second, though, Nintendo backed out of the deal because ultimately it didn't seem to favor them as far as like what they were going to get from profits on it and all, something like that. And so then eventually Nintendo went with Philips CDI, and that was a big old mess, right? In the long run, it might have been the best idea though for that. But at the time though, right, it seemed like Nintendo sort of dropped the ball with not, well, I should say in the moment, it actually seemed right because Sony doing a game system that didn't really seem right. A lot of times when a non-video game developer or company got into the video game industry, they would flop. Like, for example, the 3DO and there was just a bunch of flops that were coming out around this time as we started entering into the fifth generation. So it seemed like Sony trying to get into it, right, wasn't, it seemed like they don't have no experience doing video games. So Nintendo turned them down in a very public way, right, which is a big disrespect, right, from what they did. So Sony went to Sega. And so then Sony wanted to partner with Sega to say, let's take on Nintendo. Sega, you're also a big name in the video game industry. And then and then if you're utilizing our hardware and all, we can really make something here. From my understanding, Sega of America was all on board to do this. It seemed like a great idea. But ultimately, Sega of Japan didn't want to. And so that didn't go through. Well, what ended up happening afterwards was that Sony went on their own. They created the PlayStation, and it just absolutely dominated, right? But basically what we're getting at is that, well, first we could have had a Nintendo and Sony partnership, but then after that, since that didn't go through, we could have also had a Sony and Sega partnership. And so it's kind of interesting what would have come of that, right? But like I said, ultimately it didn't happen, but it's kind of one of the big what if stories. But we got the Sega Saturn though. And the Sega Saturn came out in Japan in late 1994, and it had some popularity at first, mainly because of Virtua Fighter. So, Virtua Fighter was a big deal. Virtua Fighter 2 had just come out or was starting to come out in the arcades. So, but Virtua Fighter the first one was still a pretty big name. And so to be able to have a decent port at home was pretty stunning. Now, the port of Virtua Fighter at home wasn't quite arcade perfect, but it was pretty close that it was turning a lot of heads, right? And so for that stretch there at the end of 1994, again, it wasn't a long stretch, but, like roughly around November to December, but the Sega Saturn outsold the Sony PlayStation. And again, Sony PlayStation, it's the new kid on the block, right? So it's all understandable, right, that it would have outsold it in that stretch there, but it did. And so there was some hope that the Sega Saturn was really going to, be a cool system that was going to, continue Sega's, dominance in the arcade scene or in the home console scene. Because the Genesis didn't quite beat the Super Nintendo, but it put up a good fight. And so the thought was that they're going to continue on with that, right? Well, eventually the Sega Saturn, a big old fiasco where they launched it early, and then Sony's, 299 announcement and all that, and then the Saturn being hard to program for, Daytona USA being a bit choppy, and so it just had a kind of a bad impression at first, and then Sony just made a lot of right moves that just basically overtook the Saturn pretty quickly on. But the Sega Saturn, though, is still an amazing system with a lot of great games, even with everything that was stacked up against it. I have so many good memories of the system here because we were still sticking with Sega at this time, right? And I remember the Sega Saturn came out. It had a surprise launch around May of 1995 or so, and we didn't get it though until roughly about a year later. And I remember that. So again, my brother, right? He started working, and he was just he started. Like I said, my dad did as much as he could, right, to try to get us a game as much as possible, and then all the games we were renting, right. So I was exposed to a lot of video games, and then I had some friends also that had like the Nintendo and the Super Nintendo. And then so eventually my brother bought the Sega Saturn, and he for some reason he kept it at his girlfriend's house though for a bit. And I remember one time he brought it over. I think maybe he was like scared that my dad would find out. I don't remember the details of that, but something like that. But I remember he didn't bring it over right away to our house. And so but I remember one day my dad was out of the house, and so he brought it over, and so I got to see Virtua Fighter 2. So that was the first game that he bought because they had the home port had already been out at that time. And I got to say, that's been one of the times that I was most impressed with a video game, seeing it at home, because 60 frames per second in that high res mode that game has just warped my mind, right? And it was the fact that I'm playing this at home, right? Because I'd already heard enough and seen enough pictures of the Virtual Fighter, the first one, how it was a decent port, but it was a bit glitchy. This one was a really comparable port, right, of a arcade game that was on much more powerful hardware than even Virtual Fighter 1 was. And the fact that they got it so right was pretty impressive. It's not arcade perfect, but it's a really damn good port. And it was amazing. It was truly an amazing experience. And that's one core memory that I have for my video game history, that of just how blown away I was by seeing that game, and the fact that we were playing it at home. And it was truly a game changer for me, because then I started thinking, in my mind, right, and I was like, with this level of graphics, what are like action games going to look like with, if they're using 3D graphics like this, and what are like RPGs going to look like, and all. So my mind was just racing with like the possibilities of what this generation was going to bring. And so it was really impressive. And so then my brother, so he was buying a game like almost every week. And so again, I got to experience a lot of games. I mean, he eventually got like Panzer Dragoon. I think that was the next game that he got. Once again, right, I was like, oh my God, right, this is incredible. And just seeing the scenery in that, hearing the beautiful music in it. And, graphics from the fifth generation, for a lot of people, haven't aged that well. I find that it has a certain charm to it still, and I can still take myself back to those days and just be blown away and immersed in those worlds as much as I, am still now with like today's games. And because a lot of it, you were still kind of using your imagination still there, and they were really trying to flesh out these incredible 3D worlds and all. And 3D gaming brought something else that 2D gaming, maybe couldn't quite do. I have a love for both of them. I almost like them both equally. They just have, pros and cons to each one. But being able to see these 3D worlds and all for the first time was just the stuff of dreams almost. And yeah, I was really amazed by that game. And then we got a Stall, which was an incredible 2D platformer. And then eventually Panzer Dragoon 2's Way, another really, graphically impressive game. Still one of the greatest last boss fights ever in a video game. Just truly stunning. And then just so many games that we got to experience on the Sega Saturn. And yeah, just had so much fun with that system there. And eventually we ended up getting a PlayStation for, the stuff that were coming out on that, specifically one major game, right, involving a certain character with a big ass sword. But yeah, the Sega Saturn, though, that was our thing for a while, and we held on to it. I mean, even after we got the PlayStation, we still, rode that system out until its dying day. And it's Yeah, I have so many fond memories of that system there, and I regret selling a lot of the games on that system because I just went through a stretch where I was trying to get rid of a lot of physical media, and also needed some money. And the Sega Saturn games were, they were fetching a pretty high price, and so was able to pay some bills, right, with selling my collection on the Sega Saturn. But I mean, that had some great games though, and all, right, that I regret giving away. So just for example, like if you know anything about like the value of certain video games and all, I had Panzer Dragoon Saga, Shining Force 3, Magic Knight Ray Earth, what other game? Guardian Heroes, Shinobi Legions, Astal. Let's see, I said Shining Force 3. Yeah, so many games that we had on that system there, and it kind of hurt. Oh, I even had like the or Vampire Savior 3, the Grandia, the import versions. Um, yeah. Oh man, I said that's like one of my regrets of my video game history is that that I had to sell the all those games there. But yeah, so much great memories with the Sega Saturn. Highly recommend you check the system out if you never have. I feel like it has a very unique library of games, and not only that, while there's been a handful of games that have had recent or releases on that you can play on modern systems, or like that you can play on other systems, there's still a lot of the library of this that's just stayed exclusive to the Sega Saturn. And so for that there, I feel like this is a system that is really fun to collect too, but kind of like the Sega CD, the games are pretty expensive though, right? So just FYI on that. But otherwise there's emulation, right? But yeah, the Sega Saturn, oh man. So, but unfortunately though, because of the mistakes that they were doing with the, because there was also the 32X, and I didn't really get into that. So I don't have a whole lot of on that, at least at the time. I've played it since through emulation, and it's okay, right? And all, but I can see why it flopped. But they were making a lot of mistakes behind the scenes. And so Sega was just bleeding a lot of money. And so, which was unfortunate just because, they make great games. It's just that some of their business decisions, caused them to basically flop, right? Eventually. But Sega was still continuing to release a lot of great games in the arcade. And so they started coming out with the Model 3. And so kind of the same as before, right? When they were coming out with games on the Model 1 and Model 2, seeing Virtua Fighter 3 and Scud Race at the, like this would have been like in 1997 or so when I first got to see them. So before like the next generation of systems started coming out, once again, right? Boom, mind blowing. And every time I would see these Sega arcade games, it was truly like I was looking into the future, and it was just so amazing seeing what they were doing there in the arcades. And so, like Virtua Fighter 3, it was stunning. It truly was. And the characters obviously still look like video game characters, but some of the backgrounds and all, at least at the time, started feeling like this was real, and it was almost, I remember feeling like almost like the sense of like eeriness, right? I was like, is this like almost like virtual reality? Like feels real. I remember seeing like Scud Race and seeing some of the background detail and all, right. And again, running at 60 frames per second. And, at the time, right. And I was like, this looks even better than real life. And so it was just truly impressive what they were doing. And definitely one of the more coolest experiences that I've had playing video games was seeing those games in the arcade. And, because I had said it before, right. This is the best that it's going to look like, video games are going to look like and all, but Virtua Fighter 3 and Scud Race was truly something else. Though it was just mighty impressive. And that eventually came with the leading to the 6th generation system, and starting off the gate with was the Sega Dreamcast. And the Sega Dreamcast, I remember being really excited about this system, as it seemed like Sega was back. And Sega seemed to be making a lot of great moves, and they were, that basically they were going to be relevant again in the home console scene, because again they lost a lot of ground with the Sega Saturn. And the Sega Dreamcast, when it first came out, it it sold really well. And I remember reading it in the newspaper or in the news and the newspaper and all that. It like broke a record, I think, for like the fastest selling system initially. And we got the system about a week later after launch, as at this time I had already moved out of the house. And so I was living, me and my brother were living with some roommates in a different city. And I was trying to save up money for it because I really wanted the Dreamcast, and but I didn't quite have the money for it though. I wasn't making a lot of money at the time, and so it was going to take me a little bit. But then about a week after it came out, my brother called and he said, "Hey, dude, I got the Dreamcast," and he had gotten Soul Calibur on it, and so I did have enough money for at least a game, so I bought Sonic Adventure. So he finally brought the system over to our, whatever we were staying at. And so we popped in Soul Calibur and, I'll say it again, right? It was one of the times again where seeing this high level of graphics at home once again, right? I was like, it just kept getting better and better and better, from previous times, right, that I had felt this. And it was truly mind blowing. Soul Calibur, it was the fact that it looked even better than in the arcades was enough to convince me, right, that we were entering into a new era of video games where the home consoles now were going to be more sought after than what was in the arcades, because the arcade scene was starting to die out a little bit. And this was sort of the big push, I think, on it, was that games are just going to look better even at home. So why go to the arcades now? And it took me a while to wrap my mind around that, right? Because again, for many, many years, like I said before, it was the arcade that was the place to be at for seeing the best things out there as far as what for the best technology in video games. And it was truly mesmerizing. It was incredible. I mean, man. Soul Calibur was just insane. I couldn't believe what I was seeing at home. And also our friend, one of our roommates, he had a pretty cool setup because we were playing on his setup there, where he had a decent sized TV for the time, and also he was a bit of a like he really liked trying to have like the best sound. He had these big ass speakers and all. And so we were playing it on a fairly large TV at the time, and then with incredible sound too. And I remember thinking like, I'd much rather be playing it here than in the arcade. This looks amazing. And so that was a really cool experience there. And then also we got to play House of the Dead 2, and that was a lot of fun too. We bought the Mad Catz guns that they were pretty good at the time, right? But House of the Dead 2, which is pretty much an arcade perfect port as well too. And so we were just, like I said, we were entering this new era of experiences that we could have at home, and so that was just cool. It was a cool experience. And yeah, the Sega Dreamcast, I mean, it gave us so much hope. Sonic Adventure was pretty cool as well. It's really been the only Sonic or 3D Sonic game that I really got into, as I eventually ended up beating the game with all the characters and all. And it's still my favorite 3D Sonic game out there. And again, I think a big part of it was just because I was so mesmerized by the graphics. And again, I'm not someone that is like, I need incredible graphics, right, to enjoy a game. This is still during a time where the jump in graphics was such a big deal, right? That you would kind of want to play games just to see it all, right? Just to see what these graphics were all about. And then, of course, if the gameplay was good as well, right? Then, that kept you hooked on it. But yeah, I was floored with a lot of the stuff that was coming out during this time here. It was truly amazing. But then we got Shenmue also, and Shenmue was something special. Shenmue, it's hard to recommend nowadays to people because especially it's a game that is very slow paced. You have to sort of like be in the moment with it. I don't know. It's kind of hard to describe. It's almost like a life simulator in a way, where you're almost literally living the life of a young man in Japan in the 1980s in a small town. And some of the stuff that you do in this, like if you've heard of Shenmue and you want to check it out because you've heard, like, oh yeah, Shenmue supposedly is pretty cool. It's almost hard to recommend. Like, I will say this: don't go into it expecting like a Yakuza game. It's not that. It's much more slower pace. It's but there was something about this game though when you first started playing it that you're everything from just like looking through your closet and all, which is it seemed like I don't. It was very immersive at the time, right? And I mean, it sounds boring now, but it's just the fact that you could even interact with a 3D world like that. It was unheard of at the time, and the graphics for the time they were pretty detailed and pretty impressive. It was a very expensive game, so Sega put a lot of money into it, which is part of Sega's downfall, though. But it was from Yu Suzuki, who he was behind a lot of the great arcade games from before, right? Everything from like Hang On to Outrun to Afterburner to Virtua Fighter and all. I mean, he was behind a lot of it. And so this is a different kind of game for him. But he definitely wanted to make this happen, though, right? And so Sega, again, put a lot of money into it. And ultimately, Shenmue is a good game, and I did appreciate it, but it wasn't quite the hit that Sega would have wanted it to be. But it definitely set the stage, though, for later games to have this kind of more open-ended gameplay. I wouldn't say it's like an open world game. It's more and Yu Suzuki described that at one point, saying something along the lines that it's like an open. I forgot what he called it, but it's kind of its own thing. And really, when you start playing it, it's like, again, don't think you're playing like a Yakuza or even like a Grand Theft Auto, right? It's different, but it's a very feel good game. It's Ryu Hazuki. He's trying to do good in the world, and so it's not like you're out there, punching whoever, right, or stealing cars or picking up hookers, and he's you're doing a lot of like good tasks in this game, and or good deeds, and then I mean, of course, there's fighting in the game too, also, right? But you're fighting the bad guys and all, and the fight system actually wasn't too bad, as it's kind of based off of Virtua Fighter, so kind of curious what they're going to do with this Virtua Fighter Crossroads game, or but Shenmue was something special, though, but because of this game and so many other things too, also eventually led to the downfall of Sega when it comes to their home consoles. And because eventually this was sometime in early 2001 where Sega made the announcement that they were bowing out of the console race, and they were going to become a third-party publisher. I can think of two instances in my time playing video games that when it came to like real world news about video game industry that has such an impact across the board. More, and this was one of them, right? The other one has been the recent announcement of Sony announcing that they're going to stop doing physical games. Those are probably then the two instances where it was almost like this, like an emotional gut punch, right? And it's just video games, but I think a lot of us felt that we're like, oh, damn, that sucks. I mean, there's been a lot of other news, right? And all that have sucked too, also, right? In the, in the many years that video games have been out there. But this is like, those are the two instances that I can think of, right? That it felt like an emotional gut punch. And, when they announced that Sega was bowing out, I think this is going to sound lame, but I think I might have even shed a tear a bit, because Sega was, everything that I've talked to about right now, right? It's Sega was my thing. And, it was highly unfortunate, right, that they were doing this. And, but again, Sega just made so many mistakes behind the scenes, and it just, starting again with the 32X, kind of the Sega CD even, and then all the peripherals that they were coming out with, the Sega Saturn, and all, and there's just so much that they were just losing money on. And there's actually a really great documentary out there. I think the channel is called Pandemonium, where it's called like Fall of a Titan or something like that. I highly recommend you watch that video. It really gives you an insight view of what happened with Sega, because what happened was that a few years ago, there was some leaked documents that came out that were put up on the internet that really goes into detail, right? Like the numbers of just how bad Sega was doing, right? Financially. And so, it was unfortunate, but there was, so Sega almost went bankrupt, and we could have lost Sega forever. But there was I think it was like a shareholder or someone that he was one of the top people of Sega in Japan, that he used a lot of his own money or part of his shares or something like that he gave back to Sega to keep him afloat. And so eventually, they had enough money to move over to be third-party publishers for the other systems. And had it not been because of this man, we could have lost Sega completely forever. Right. And then my understanding is that shortly afterwards, he passed away. So he, he really kept the dream alive, so to speak. And so, and that was almost like his gift, right, to keep the brand alive and all. Um, but yeah, but we definitely lost the Titan. You know, again, Sega was never number one. I mean, you could say they were number one in the arcades, maybe, right? But as far as like in the home consoles, they were never number one. You know, I never mentioned the SG 1000 or 100. But you know that was an early system from Sega that they lost, and then the Sega Master System, you know, they lost against Nintendo. The Sega Genesis put up a hell of a fight against the Super Nintendo, but when it comes to numbers, it didn't quite beat it. And then the Sega Saturn, obviously, right, and all came in third place between the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation. And then the Sega Dreamcast. I mean, it started off really strong, but it died out pretty quickly as well too. But you know, for the people that were around that were you know that had Sega as their either whether it was their main console or their second console, whatever the case is, we have a lot of fond memories of what Sega was capable of, and so all of this happened up until 2001. Okay, so we're talking about the early 80s to 2001. So that's like what, 20, a little over 20 years there, that we had this Sega that was it was its own thing. You know, it was a pretty big player in the video game industry. So if you don't know about Sega, if you know Sega now, right, you're gonna know them from like Atlas games and then like their Yakuza games and then Sonic. There was so much more to them, right? They had so much potential, so many great games, and that unfortunately, right, it was their business decisions that kind of ruined them. But the games that they made though were just incredible though. And so eventually they went to third party publishing. And which I thought was still kind of cool though, right? I was like, well, you know, at the very least, as long as we don't lose our games, was my thought. And we started getting games on. They started publishing games like on the Game Boy Advance. We got a Sonic Advance games on there, and then eventually on the PlayStation 2, which they some of their first games that they came out on that was like the Virtua Fighter 4 came out on that, which is an excellent fighting game. And then on the GameCube, they put out Sonic Adventure, and what else did they do? And this is initially Virtual Quest, I think, was another early game that they came out on there. But then they were also co-developing like something like F-Zero GX. And then on the Xbox, so now my understanding is that Sega and Microsoft almost had a deal. And so because of that, and also because the Dreamcast used Windows as part of their operating system, they already have a bit of a relationship with Xbox, and so some of the games that got ported over to the Xbox almost seemed like there were games that would have come out on the Dreamcast. So like, I mean, Shenmue 2 came out on the Xbox, which did come out on the Dreamcast as well too. But yeah, a port of Shenmue 2 came out on the Xbox, and then we had Panzer Dragoon Orta, which feels like that could have come out on the Sega Dreamcast. Gun Valkyr, Jet Set Radio Future. Toe Jam and Earl. And so again, those were games that felt like they would have been on the Dreamcast, but so in that way, the Xbox sort of felt like a spiritual successor to the Dreamcast there. And so trying to keep the dream alive there. So the first initial batch of games that they put as a third party publisher were pretty cool, right? And they still felt like Sega games to an extent. As the year started going on though, you know, Sega, I feel like they really lost a lot of their identity, unfortunately for me. They've come out with some great games, but it just didn't quite feel the same. You know, it wasn't like the Sega from the past. And I mean, nowadays, I mean, because they started coming out with this Yakuza series, and I'm not too familiar with these Yakuza games, honestly. I definitely want to play them. I just haven't gotten around to it. But you know, that series has kept Sega afloat. I mean, they seem to be, you know, really good games, and there's a ton of them that keep coming out. It's insane how many Yakuza games keep coming out. And then eventually they partnered with Atlas. And so with Atlas, they've been publishing games with them. So like the Persona games have been huge. You know, more recently, they've also done like that Metaphor Fantasio game. And so they've been, you know, doing really well with them as well, too, with a lot of the RPGs that they come out with. And then, you know, Sonic games, right, are still coming out. And recently they've come out with some fairly cool games, too, like kind of going back into their, you know, legacy IPs. So There was a Streets of Rage 4, which is absolutely excellent. That's my favorite 2D beat 'em up of all time, and just a really great sequel. There was last year there was a Shinobi Art of Vengeance, which is pretty cool too. Also, not quite my favorite Shinobi game, but it's a really cool game though too. And there's also like the Wonder Boy, the Dragon's Trap remake that came out. I thought this was it kind of went under the radar, I feel, for a lot of people, but I think it's really excellent. And so they're still doing their thing, right? And of course, they're coming out with a bunch of Sonic games still, which have been, kind of a hit and miss sometimes, but still, the Sonic the Hedgehog, though, is still a pretty big name overall. The games are still coming out. It's had 3 successful movies, too, that have been a lot of fun to watch. There was Sonic 1, Sonic 2, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, and then Sonic the Hedgehog 3. And then we're also getting Sonic the Hedgehog 4 that's been announced already. And I think it's coming out here sometime soon, I believe. And so the name of Sonic is still really strong. And, it's, it never quite reached the popularity of like Mario, but it's definitely a strong IP. And so Sega's still around. They're still doing their thing, but it just never felt the same anymore. And so I do miss Sega being in the console race, and it just never felt the same afterwards. And again, the PlayStation and the Xbox have definitely given us some good memories, and I'll share some of those eventually when I get around to those videos. But man, we did lose something though when Sega bowed out of the console race. And yeah, a lot of great memories though with this, with their systems, their games, their attitude that they had. The whole stretch from the Sega Genesis, that's been some of the most aggressive and fun marketing that I've ever seen of a video game console do, because they were going all out, right, to go up against Nintendo, but they spent a lot of money too, right, doing that, and it definitely made him a very prominent figure in the video game industry, but it came at a cost though. And, just the combination with all the other mistakes that they made was why, we ended up losing them as a console maker. But so many great memories with Sega, and definitely recommend you go back and check out a lot of their games here. It's definitely like I said earlier, right, that, if I were to think of, which video game console is the one that I have the most attachment to, or video game company, it's Sega. And it's not that, they have like my favorite games of all time, but it's just the memories that I have with this, their games and their consoles and all, that just truly left an impression on me. And so that's why Sega just sort of has my heart when it comes to video games, and just so much great times with them. But that's what I got for this here. So this is, again, a series that I'm trying to do where I'm sharing off memories of some of the bigger video game publishers out there. And so again, I'll be doing, so this is one for Sega. I'll be doing one for Nintendo, PlayStation, then eventually Xbox, and just, sharing memories that I've had throughout the years, right, with their games and their consoles. But let me know, is there anything that special memories that you have with anything that has to do with Sega? Would definitely be interested in hearing about that. Feel free to let me know there in the comments. Until then, though, hopefully this gave you a little bit of a trip down nostalgia lane, and we'll see you in the next one. Have a good one.